So one of you should have the option to share your screen. Okay, great. Why don't you do it in presentation mode if you can? There you go. Great stuff. All right, go ahead, take it away.
All right, so we are Cabbage Patch, and our presentation today is on Florida's endangered species and the conservation efforts both past and present. Next slide, please. And so just a little bit of an introduction. It's very important to understand why biodiversity is so important to Florida, because it's very important for the conservation of these animals. And Florida is a biodiversity hotspot with over 100 endangered species. But we will be focusing today on the Florida panther, the gopher tortoise, and the black bear. Next slide, please. And this is just showing their current statuses. So the gopher tortoise and black bear were previously endangered, but now they're a species of least concerned and vulnerable respectively, while the Florida panther is currently critically endangered. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, just our table of contents will be going over biodiversity, the endangered species, some current projects, and our solutions and key findings. Next slide, please. Great. Next slide, please. So once again, Florida is a biodiversity hotspot. It has over 1,500 endemic plant species and 700 animal species. Between the two of those, there's 100 endangered species living here. And Florida is a very optimal place for these species to live because it has a dynamic environment due to its temperate and subtropical zones. It's surrounded on three sides by warm water, so this allows for relatively consistent temperatures. Next slide, please. And biodiversity is important because it promotes the ecosystem services that humans and animals both rely on. It is also essential in solving the climate crisis that's currently affecting these endangered species. And it's both a fundamental part of our culture and our identity, which we see with like our national symbol of the bald eagle, and another group mentioned the elephant for Thailand. So next slide, please. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce the Florida panther. So the Florida panther is currently critically endangered with only 120 individuals in the wild. And it is a subspecies of the mountain lion and used to live all the way from Georgia down to the southern tip of Florida, but it now only currently resides in the southwest tip of Florida in the Big Cypress National Preserve and the Everglades National Park. It's also an umbrella species because they are such large animals that roam. By protecting them and their land, we're also protecting the species that live in the same habitat as them. Next slide, please. And panthers are endangered for many reasons. The two main reasons, though, are low genetic diversity and roadkill. So because there are so few individuals, panthers are constantly breeding with, inbreeding with individuals with similar DNA to them. So anything like a bout of a disease or something like that could threaten the entire population because they all share very similar genetic makeup. And with land use and development increasing in Southwest Florida, there's increased cases of roadkill with many of their deaths each year being caused by vehicular accidents. Next slide, please. This graph right here just shows a little bit of that with plotting the total number of deaths versus the number of deaths caused by automobiles. And you can see that a very significant amount of those deaths are by cars.
Okay, so the next species that we did is the gopher tortoise. And you can do the next slide. And the gopher tortoise is a keystone species, and it's really important because there's roughly 350 commensal species that rely on it. And the species that rely on it range from insects, lizards, snakes, small rodents, and some bird species. And many of the animals seek refuge in the burrows, which is why their burrows are also protected. And because they want to live there and seek refuge in prescribed burns. And the gopher tortoise is the only tortoise species in Florida, and it can be found in all 67 counties. And it's under threat due to habitat construction, which is mostly just due to new housing projects and urban developments. and the habitats that they live in, which is like longleaf pine forest. And the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission formulated their one main project to protect gopher tortoises, which is the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan. And it came out in 2012. And it's a 10-year plan with the goal of no net loss of the gopher tortoises by 2022, with their first objective is to minimize the loss by ensuring a safe relocation of the tortoises and best management practices for the lands that are going to be developed and agricultural lands to reduce the mortality rate and disease. And then the second objective is to increase the gopher tortoises habitat. And to do this, they're trying to acquire 57,000 acres of land per year from private landowners and public lands. And that also includes like wildlife corridors and incentives to promote the habitat management conservation. And they'll offer like certificates and stuff for people with private land that have a gopher tortoise. And then the third objective was to enhance and restore the population of the tortoises in areas where they are severely endangered or no longer occur. And this mainly took a lot of, and is still taking a lot of evaluations of lands and habitats and mapping where the populations are the biggest and where they're the smallest. And they also do a gopher tortoise sighting report. So when people see them walking around, that helps them with the third objective to log the tortoises and where they're at. And the final objective is to maintain the tortoise as a keystone species. And this objective focuses mostly on the commensal species and maintaining those species and keeping them near tortoise burrows and stuff and relocating them in areas like that. And the plan came out in 2012 and it was revised July 2020. And they want to have all these goals accomplished in 2022. And they have a donation fund for the Gopher Tortoise Habitat Fund for them. And then you can do the next slide now.
Okay, so this is my part. It's on past or endangered conservation, specifically looking at the Florida black bear.
You need to lean closer to your microphone, please.
I'm sorry, could you hear me better now?
Better.
Okay. So this slide is in 2012, after decades of hard work by conservationists to increase the population, Florida's largest and mammal was finally removed from the endangered species list. It was actually removed in, please stay back on that one. It was actually removed June of 2012 due to strong population numbers because of the protection and conservation measures put into place. And now the next one. So this is just looking at the FWC management plan, kind of like with the gopher tortoise, just through the bears. So the first step was translocation, which is moving bears away from people to areas with room to allow for natural movements and gene flow of populations. The second one is habitat preservation. So tens of millions of dollars have actually been put into creating wildlife corridors for these bears. It's been roughly about 40,000 acres preserved to try and help them. Step 3 is continuing the Bear Wise program. And what the Bear Wise program is it's a program through FWC to try to help teach people to coexist with bears. And step 4 is kind of a part of that, educating the public on the bears. And one quote from them is, "A fed bear is a dead bear." So if you live in Florida, do not feed the bears. It's also, they do regulated hunting, and that's kind of what the quote off to the side is about. They actually did a hunt in Florida in October of 2015. So they're called BMUs, and they're bear management units within Florida. And 4 out of the 7 actually participated in the hunt, and 304 bears were actually killed. And this is just to kind of thin out the population a little bit, I guess, as they're getting too close to people, but they're currently not planning any other hunts. And next slide, please. So this is just kind of looking at the results of the black bears. And if you can look on that little graph of Florida, those little sections are actually the BMUs, so the bear management units. And you can kind of see how they went up, specifically where we are at, which is the Eastern Panhandle, and we've went up almost 86%. And then it says up in the top, it says like in the 1970s, the estimated number of adult black bears was under 300. So now we're actually closer to about 4,000. So that just kind of shows you how high they go up. So there are actually more bears in the state of Florida right now than there have been at any other time in the past 100 years. And next slide, please. So this is actually pretty cool. So these are bear tracks actually here in Tallahassee that I went out and found a couple weeks ago. So it's kind of by the airport, if anybody knows where that is. There's like a huge colony of bears that live out there. And if anybody ever wants to go, it is super cool. But these are just news articles about how many bears there actually are where we live. And so this is a part of like the Bear Wise program, just being aware, knowing that they do live here with us and to kind of be careful and to try and help promote that. And that link down there is actually just an interactive map, which you can click on if you wanted to. And it kind of shows you where you can log information about the bears, kind of like with the gopher tortoises, just kind of seeing where they are and kind of helping maintain that. That's it.
Okay, part 3. We're just going to kind of further go into detail about the conservation projects. Okay, and then we're going to look at federally funded and then state funded ones. Okay, so like the main state funded project we wanted to highlight was the tracking software that was mentioned for the black bears and also the gopher tortoises. The FWC launched an app that allows citizens to monitor the location of gopher tortoises and also black bears. There's also online websites that you can go in and just log in the information about where you saw black bears or tortoises, and it kind of helps relay this information to professionals who are tracking them and kind of keeping track of their population and things like that. And then go ahead, Cam.
Yeah. And then for the panthers, we have like a combination of a federally and privately funded effort. So both HCPs and HCBs, which are habitat conservation plans and banks, allow people to build on the land, but at a certain cost. So with the plan, people are able to purchase the land, but they have a little bit of a role in the habitat conservation for the panthers. While with the banks, they're purchasing credits and don't play as much of a role with the actual conservation, but the money from the credits is used in maintaining the actual habitat. And then just with the pictures at the bottom, sorry, if you can go back real quick. Those are just some pictures captured with cameras used for wildlife corridors. So there's a lot of wildlife corridors in Southwest Florida that panthers can go under overpasses instead of having to cross the roads. And the cameras allow the professionals to track the movement of panthers and how many go through specific corridors. Next slide, please.
Alrighty, so the last part, we're just going to go over some of the key findings and some of the solutions that have worked in the past. Essentially, the breeding area for Florida panthers is only 5% of what it used to be. I have a graph on the next slide that kind of shows that. And the leading cause of death for Florida panthers is vehicle collisions. And then, like we stated before, the greatest threat to gopher tortoises is habitat deconstruction. And as a result of this, land is federally regulated that is known to hold gopher tortoises. So before any
2 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So before any companies get permission to get land, they have to get a special permit. So this right here, this graph, the red is just the historical content or this historical breeding range of the Florida panthers. This was 30 years ago, and then the current breeding range is the little green in South Florida. So the common trends in species decline that we found was habitat deconstruction, and this is essentially just with more people coming to Florida, we have more housing that we need, and that infrastructure development can kind of take away from the habitats. Pollution, as the pollution grows over the state, it affects our waterways mainly, and it, for the gopher tortoise specifically, it reduces their access to clean water. And then human activity, this is just the hunting and driving things like running them over in the car and not paying attention to road signs, things like that. And then the main solutions that we found were the landscape conservation. Sorry, one second. Two laptops up. Okay, so this conservation plan was presented by Randy Katz and our research team back in 2005. He's still working on work today for the conservation of panthers, but the plan basically consisted of identifying key areas for sustaining wildlife populations through statistical analysis and documentation of panther roaming sites and how these are impacted by the increasing Florida population. And this is also really valuable to kind of combine science and wildlife avocation because it allows them to kind of know the areas in which need to be protected. And then, of course, the conservation projects. As we can see, the efforts from the Black Bear Conservation Project were really successful because they were moved from the endangered species list. And then this is just kind of individual things we could do to kind of, work towards maintaining these populations as well. Slow down while driving, electing officials that kind of have environmental views that align with yours, and then educating yourself on the local and statewide projects. And then these are our questions.
All right, does that wrap you up?
Yeah, that's it for us. Thanks.
Okay, very good. You're just under time, and we have time for some questions. So any questions from the class? If not, I have some questions. Go ahead, class. Why don't you flip back to the questions that you asked there so people have a little chance to look at that. Okay, well, I had a couple of questions. What's the difference between a turtle and a tortoise?
I can answer that. So the main difference between like a turtle and a tortoise is most tortoises are land developing. I actually have a pet tortoise behind me. So I love when people like accidentally, they call them a tortoise. They call a tortoise a turtle. That is like a biggest thing for me. I hate when people do it. But most turtles are in water. Most tortoises are on land.
So like a box turtle, is that a turtle or a tortoise?
Turtle.
But it doesn't go in the water. It's on land.
I'm not sure.
How deep are the burrows that tortoises dig? You didn't show any pictures of those burrows, and they're pretty critical things.
Sorry, they can go, I read one where they can be like just a few feet deep, but then they found some that are like nearly 30 feet long, and the tortoises will dig multiple ones in their lives. But they all, like some of them are really long, and then some of them are just like a few feet long, and it all ranges.
Oh, wow. So does each turtle dig its own burrow, or do they reuse it? Is like subsequent generations reuse the burrows?
They all dig their own, and most tortoises, there was some male tortoises will dig almost, I think it was like 15 to 30 in their lives. They'll dig multiple in their lives.
Wow, so they just spend all their time digging burrows. Cool.
Yep.
All right, question about black bears. Where was that place in Tallahassee where you could find bears?
So it's called Dog Lake. It's actually out by the airport.
Okay.
So it's a dirt bike track actually. But if you hike back there, you'll start seeing like bear feces. And if you keep going like past where everybody is, there's like a hole, like you can see where they lay down. There's tracks and it's all sand. So I bought some plaster actually. I'm going to go try and like make molds of the tracks. But there's at least like, I go out there at night and there's at least like 15 bears that live out there.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And the next group to speak is the fantastic Ferns. So thanks everybody for your talk from the Cabbage Patch and fantastic Ferns. Are you ready to go? Please activate your cameras and share your screen, and we'll get started.
Okay. Did that work? Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, you better.
Yeah.
It's better to do it in presentation. There you go. Great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we are the Fantastic Ferns, and we did our presentation on agriculture and the economic, environmental, and social impacts, and then ways it can be sustainably implemented. So Madison's going to introduce it. Hannah's going to talk about economic impacts. Myra's going to talk about environmental impacts. I'm going to talk about social impacts. And then Allie's going to talk about sustainable implementation. So I'll hand it off to Madison.
Thank you. So first, a little introduction. Aquaculture is the farming of aquatic species, whether that be fish, plants, algae, crustaceans. So for some types of aquaculture, we have some high risk, which would be the open net pens and ponds. Open net pens are typically found offshore, and they're sort of like cages, and they allow the exchange of waste, parasites, diseases, and more between the farm fish and surrounding ocean environment, and those are popular for salmon. Ponds are semi or fully enclosed bodies of water, and they're primarily used for tilapia and shrimp. And with these, the wastewater must be managed. And an example of this going wrong is sort of shrimp ponds and mangrove destruction. The low risk would be the closed systems, raceways, recirculation systems, and suspended aquaculture. Closed systems just means there's a barrier between the aquaculture and the surrounding natural area. Raceways are typically used for trout, and they divert water from streams or wells. Recirculation systems, they treat and recirculate the water. And then suspended aquaculture is typically used for shellfish, and it's farming on beaches or suspended in the water. Next slide, please. And then we focused on determining the sustainability of aquaculture by looking at the economy, the effects on the economy, the environment, and on fishing communities. And then we have a little video right here, but we'll come back to that later if we have time. All right, thank you. Now on to Hannah.
So when it comes to analyzing the economic issues and economic impact of aquaculture, it's a little bit difficult to decide before you actually implement it, the impact it's going to have. And so there's actually a lot of argument whether or not the economic harm that it could possibly cause will outweigh the possible environmental benefit. And there is a lot of environmental benefits. We'll talk about that later on. But there's quite a bit of possible economic harm, including the possibility of a boom or bust production cycle, which basically means that when you first implement it, there could be a lot of money made by investors. It could create a lot of jobs. But then if other issues like the cost of technology and production and different kinds of possible lack of demand, because there's a lot of argument that many people might not favor aquaculture product over wild caught fish, and then therefore it could cause the industry to crash very quickly, especially in a capitalistic economy like more developed nations have. It could cause it to crash very quickly, and therefore investors lose their money, and then many people lose their jobs. And the next slide, please. But then there's also an argument that it could be beneficial in more developing countries because there's less possibility of this boom or bust cycle to take place, because aquaculture will support these rural economies that usually already rely on fish, and it could provide these developing countries like Ghana and the other in Malaysia that I have listed here to participate in exports, imports, and trades and grow their economy, create jobs. And it also has proved to shown in different research that it can help improve the poverty gap and household income. You can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Hannah. So I'm going to talk about the environmental aspects, and I just wanted to start off talking about where aquaculture and the production of fish is most popular around the world. This was from a study in 2013, and we can see that China, North America, and the western coast of South America and North and Western Europe are popular for using fishing and aquaculture, and this is major for the ecosystems that reside in these areas. So it's important to keep that in mind when doing aquaculture. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about the positive environmental impacts of aquaculture. As we discussed earlier, the confinement of fishing definitely decreases the overfishing and bycatch issue that occurs with traditional fishing practices. And it allows for a certain amount of fishing to take place to make sure that there's no overfishing or depletion of population for natural fish populations. And then we can also see to the right, there's a graph that describes the location of where aquaculture takes place. And it's a little hard to see, but it's showing that aquaculture takes place mainly in fresh water and brackish water. So this takes pressure off of the ocean and any chances for destruction of ocean ecosystems or the chemistry of the ocean to remain relatively untouched by aquaculture. So next slide, please. But unfortunately, there are numerous negative effects that come with aquaculture. First, we can talk about the nutrient leaching from fish feed and organism excretion. In a study, it was said that 85% of phosphorus, 80 to 88% of carbon, and 52 to 95% of nitrogen was excessive in certain areas near aquaculture areas that led into waterways. And this can lead to eutrophication, which we've learned is detrimental to numerous ecosystems, both in the water and out of the water as well. Aquaculture can also lead to cage culture, which is when carnivorous fish start to injure or eat each other, and this can be very counterproductive in the production of fish and the success of this aquaculture system where that happens. Aquaculture can also lead to decreased wild biodiversity since aquaculture farmers, I suppose, choose the strongest fish from their natural habitat and use that to breed and lead or leave weaker fish to remain in the wild. And lastly, as we discussed earlier, the mangroves is a main issue with aquaculture, as aquaculture developments destroy basically natural habitats on the coast and inland as well. So next slide.
Okay, and so kind of like how Hannah said, aquaculture can have like a really positive impact on economies, especially in rural, poor, and developing countries, specifically through providing things like food and job security. Around 18 million people currently work on fish farms, and that amount triples when accounting for secondary employment, like people who work in fish farms or people who transport fish and other products, that sort of thing. And with this increased employment opportunities, more women are able to enter their workforce in these areas, which increases their own personal income. And since household expenditures are typically the concerns of women in many rural areas, money is spent on household needs, which improves the overall well-being of the family. And then with more of these employment opportunities, of course, comes more economic activity and business development, specifically in countries like Myanmar, where many have found employment through fishing farm plants. Increased business development has been seen overall, which has in turn contributed to their national GDP. I think it's estimated that around like 2,800 people have been employed through agriculture there, which, like I said before, doesn't account for secondary jobs that are created through the result of agriculture. And this picture to the side just shows the amount of fish farms that are in Myanmar, which is kind of cool. And then selling these value products on a national and international market level also contributes to the country's GDP and economic activity. And then agriculture also, the development of it improves other services like infrastructure. So since there's more roads are needed to transport things to the farms and like take products away. So this kind of opens up a market channel to allow other markets to infiltrate communities, things like healthcare, education opportunities, stuff like that. And agriculture also gives employees a more stable location. So that allows them to kind of think about families and like have proper housing and things like that. And it gives them a more regular work schedule, which allows them to kind of incorporate more leisure activities into their lives, which also kind of adds to their overall well-being. But there are also negative social impacts, kind of like how Mira said, there's through replacing mangroves in countries like Indonesia, which is seen in this picture to the side, through replacing those with shrimp ponds, taking those out is taking resources away from the surrounding community. So the profits that do come from having those shrimp ponds in that community isn't really equally distributed, since the owners of the ponds are the only ones benefiting, while the local community who relied on those mangroves for things like food, building materials, and firewood, things like that, don't really And then agriculture is also typically used to replenish wild fish populations that have been depleted due to wild fishing industry. However, sometimes they tend to bring diseases and parasites with them, and then this worsens the hardship on the wild fishing industry with the competition that agriculture brings. And then market competition. So overall, agriculture has lowered seafood prices due to increased supply. However, it's only if the two products are substitutes of one another. So if they aren't substitutes of one another, then it really has no effect on the price that wild fishing industry can set for their fish catches. So the generalization that agriculture will always kind of beat the wild caught fish is kind of made with caution, because it really does depend on where the market is and what exactly they are selling. However, though, agriculture does have a greater supply of fish, so they're able kind of to lower their price rates, which most consumers will kind of choose the lower priced product over the higher priced product, which affects the income of wild fishers.
So we've kind of proven that how environmentally sound a site is and the overall sustainability of said site is very closely linked. This means that if the environment starts to deteriorate, the site is no longer sustainable. For aquaculture to be sustainable, there needs to be meticulous planning and monitoring that goes on before implementing the site. This can be done if there is a focus on the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, if the site is cost effective, if the site is studied for long-term environmental effects, and the overall naturalness of the site. What I really wanted to spend this time on is to focus on this one example in Spain. So this is a 27,000 acre fish farm. It has
2 minutes.
no added, sorry?
2 minutes.
Okay. It has no added chemicals. There's no food ratios or any other 21st century technology that is traditionally used in these sites. The site is 100% natural, and the only maintenance that is done is to correct damage done by storms, if there is any. And what's really interesting about this is that the fish aren't fed, so there's not an economic strain on buying fish feed. There is no interference in the overwhelming bird population in the area as well. It is a farm that doesn't just not feed its animals. It's not just a farm that measures its success by the health of its predators, but it's a farm that's literally a water purification plant. Before becoming a fish farm, the lands were used as a drained wetland to raise cattle, and that completely wiped the lands from the nutrients and killed almost 90% of all of the birds. But now this farm is one of the most successful fish farms in all of Spain, and it's the world's biggest private bird sanctuary, which is really interesting because the birds are what kill off the fish, but it's still one of the most successful fish farms in the country. Can you go to the next slide? That being said, our presentation shows an analysis of the effects on aquaculture, and it answers the question, should it be implemented on a wider scale? And our answer is yes, aquaculture has potential. However, if we really need to look at the effects from the environment and the society to be able to implement certain things. But if it follows the adoption of the best management practice, it can create a natural, sustainable fish sites, just like the example that I provided in Spain. The next slide.
Okay, great. I thank you for being under time, and we have a couple minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience? No questions? Could you go back to, I think it was slide 10, one that showed there, that's the one. So would you talk a little bit more about what's actually going on in those two maps?
Oh yeah, so in the map below, that is a picture of, I know it's in Indonesia, it's next to the Gulf of Fonseca, if I'm saying that right, but In the picture below, that's before the agriculture was, or the shrimp ponds specifically were implemented, and then the image above is after. I just thought it was like a cool overlook of how drastic or the change is.
Okay, so all those rectangular things are ponds that were dug and, you know, displacing the native estuary area, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Oh, interesting. And so that happens a lot then with aquaculture, is that there's a, you know, a real removal. How sustainable are those kinds of settings in the estuarine areas? Do the ponds last forever, or is there? So it looks like there's some ponds that are, you know, in that map. Looks like there may be some places that are no longer have water in them.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure how long they last for. I kind of just looked at the effects that it had on the communities that kind of rely on the natural area around there. So like specifically with Indonesia removing like the mangroves from those areas and putting shrimp ponds instead, that takes away, like the mangroves supply a lot of like the wood from the mangroves is used for like building materials, firewood, and then all of the ecosystem that it is, and kind of like the animals that rely on the mangroves. Without them, they're gone, and that takes away kind of like a food source for the communities that also live there as well. So I'm not quite sure how, but I see what you're saying, how it's kind of, some of them look like the water's kind of gone away.
Yeah,
So
well, I've read that they, you know, that when they raise shrimp intensively, it changes the soils and in the bottom of the ponds, and, you know, after not very long, you know, 10 years or less, you know, the water quality cannot be maintained within the ponds, and they have to drain them because otherwise they become toxic. All right.
It looks like if those pictures, if the green is actually foliage in those pictures, it looks like in 1999, it looks like all the everything was kind of rejuvenated by those ponds almost, because everything looks a lot greener.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I see what you're saying, that in the 1987 picture. Well, we don't know. I mean, that would be something that could come out. It's hard to get that just from a picture. Do you have your questions, guys?
Oh yeah, I think we emailed them to you. Do you want me to show them on the doc as well?
Yeah, real quickly, so that there's a record on the video.
Mm-hmm. Let me look at.
You should probably like unbold the answers first before you show it.
Oh wait, yeah, sorry. I stopped sharing then and then show it again.
Okay, well, just go ahead and email me that, and I will post it then, because we probably need to.
I unbolded them if you want to show them really quick, but.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, they're okay. I'll click on it.
All right. Very good.
And then the last one right here.
Okay, great. And also, we'll go ahead and stop there. And then I'll remind the Cabbage Patch to please send me their questions, because I'm not sure that I got them. All right, well, let's move on. Our next third presentation. Well, thank you very much, Fantastic Ferns. Good presentation. And let's go on to the green machine, folks. Would you please activate your screen and get ready for a great presentation. All right, whoever is.
Yeah, I'm sharing it. Can you see it okay?
Yeah, looks fine.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Is Brittany here?
Brittany,
I guess. Not. Okay, that's fine. I'll start. Okay, so we are the Big Lean Green Machine, and we are doing our presentation on coastal management. specifically comparing two different ecosystems to evaluate the efficiency of the protection of the coastline. My name is Katie Parker. If everyone else would like to introduce themselves.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Whitney Lewis.
I'm Zane Massengale.
I'm Zoe Prado.
And I'm Lauren Upper.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and start with our thesis, which is basically kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to discuss how North and South Florida are two very distinct coastal regions that require different coastal management techniques. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start with just kind of the history and background of coastal management, different techniques that we have, and then we're going to dive into the North and South Florida ecosystems and how coastal management practices are being used there. And then we're going to just kind of do a little conclusion about what we think are the best practices. Okay, so to begin, we're going to kind of define coastal management as a practice that protects the coastline from erosion and flooding, as well as the environment around it. Okay, with the discussion of coastal management, we really need to look at sea level rise. With the history of sea level rise, in the past 70 years, sea level rise around Florida has increased by about 8 inches. The major cause of this is climate change due to the melting ice caps. But you can see in those pictures on the left, that's a 10-year difference of the melting with this glacier. And then also with coastal management, specifically in Florida, the sea level rise has created specific issues that we have to deal with because of our foundation. This figure also kind of talks about the history of sea level rise. This is in Virginia Key, Florida, which is southern Florida. And as you can see, in the past 10 years, we have pretty much doubled our sea level rise change. It went from about 4 inches to about 8.5 compared to previous years. Okay. The major causes of sea level rise is that melting ice from the poles due to climate change, which has been increasing significantly since the 1990s. This has then led to slowing down the Gulf Stream because the fresh water from the melting glaciers has mixed in with the salt water from the ocean. And if you look at the complications side, we see that this slowing Gulf Stream is a problem because with the combined gravitational pull from the moon, it creates an increase. It pulls the water toward inland. So with the Gulf Stream slowed down, it can pull more water, which leads to what's called king tides, which we'll discuss later, which is basically a exceptionally high tide that is normally about a foot higher than normal tides. Okay. In Florida specifically, we have a porous limestone foundation, which creates problems because it's full of holes. So traditional methods such as a seawall cannot be used to mitigate sea level rise. This is because if you look at the figure to the left, in a typical foundation on the top picture, the seawall would prevent the water from coming into the foundation. It would prevent the sea level rise from getting into the groundwater systems. Whereas in Florida, as the sea level increases, the salt water kind of goes under the seawall and through the limestone. So it rises at the same rate as the sea level. Okay, future of sea level rise. So in the last 31 years, there was about 6 inches of sea level rise. However, in the next upcoming 15 years, we're expected to see 6 more inches of sea level rise. Basically, our rate has doubled of sea level rise. And this figure shows 2 different projected paths of sea level rise. The left is Key West, which is going to be southern Florida, and the right is going to be Panama City, which is northern Florida. So we're expected to see over 10 inches of sea level rise by 2050.
All right, and what goes along with sea level rise is natural disasters and the threats that they have on our Florida coastlines. So flooding, high tides cause flooding regardless of the weather, but tidal flooding has increased 352% since 2000 as a result of sea level rise. And this stresses our drainage systems, which are designed to channel excess rainwater to the sea, but excess pressure from sea level rise and these higher tides cause waters to get pushed back into the pipes and back up through the system into our streets. And then another natural disaster is hurricanes. Due to climate change and like warming surface level water temperatures, we're going to have more increased intensity and increase in number of hurricanes. And the extra inches of sea level rise allow hurricanes to push even more water onto our lands, onto our coasts. And this means an even higher storm surge with storm events like that. And then so the effects on human life, oh my bad. That's good. The effects of human life are as a result of these flooding and sea level rises is that roads can be affected, which impacts people's commute to work. It can also, it's our infrastructure, so that can cost our government a lot of money to fix it. My bad. And so it can also affect our drinking water systems since sea level rise can cause and push water through pressure in pipes, salt water to infiltrate our drinking systems. It also places pressure on our sewage systems, which are very expensive to repair and also create a human health hazard. And then natural disasters, like I mentioned, hurricanes can completely wipe out communities with the excess of storm surge. And this is detrimental to the economy and the ecosystems of these places. And an example of that is Hurricane Irma in 2017. So the effects on the environment. So sea level rise doesn't just take away the amount of lands that like people can live on, it also affects the animals who live there and are indigenous to there. So sea level rise will push the animals further and further back, which causes more competition. And it also can affect the ecological niche and the needs of each species. And in addition, sea level rise pushes saltwater into different ecosystems such as estuaries, and this can throw off the balance, therefore affecting the biodiversity of these ecosystems. And then one specific example of an ecosystem is coral reefs. They experience bleaching, disease, and damage from erosion. And as a result, or another example is that fisheries, both natural fisheries and like aquaculture fisheries can experience habitat loss and differences in the water, which affects how the fish are raised. And then, so what are we going to do to like combat this? Traditionally, there have been 2 different like schools of management techniques. So we have hard structures and we have soft structures. So our hard structures are going to be man-made creations that are going to be to like block out the water. So these include things like seawalls, breakwaters, revetments. And so if you look at the top left of the screen, that's going to be a breakwater, and it's designed to break the waves before they get to shore to prevent erosion. And then the bottom is going to be a revetment, which has like slatted wood to also prevent erosion. And these are often frowned upon because they can be very detrimental to the ecosystems of the coasts that they alter. And the costs are higher as they are man-made, and they need to be replaced frequently as they break down. And then so soft structures are like a different school of thought, you can say. They're more about, instead of changing and adding things, like man-made structures, they're about like revitalizing the ecosystem as it naturally is. So this includes things such as dune construction and beach nourishment, which is also known as beach filling, which is where you take sands from a different place and add them to a beach to rebuild up the coastline. These methods also are not perfect as they're very expensive, and there is a shortage of the specific types of sands needed for beach filling. And these, since it's erosion and they're just soils, these must be repeated over and over again.
So to discuss some of the regional effects that Florida will face from sea level rise, the low-lying coastal regions that are often heavily populated throughout Florida, especially in areas like Miami, will experience more flooding and risk from higher tides. King tides are already prevalent in the Miami Beach area and cause damage to downtown streets, drainage systems, property, and automobiles. And this tide-induced flooding has increased more than 400% in the Miami Beach area since 2006. Next slide, please. Okay, so sea level rise also exacerbates the coastal erosion of beach areas. As the sea level increases, it has a larger reach to push and pull sand from the beaches. During storm events, it also causes higher energy impacts from surges and larger waves, which act to loosen beach sand and displace it into less stable areas where it can be further transported away from where it was intended to stay. And this picture below shows a stretch of Miami Beach before and after Hurricane Irma. And it's very easy to see how just one event could very disrupt it very much so, and displace the sand. Next slide, please. So sea level rise also threatens freshwater delivery. So that's like the delivery and zoning of freshwater in marine ecosystems. So coastal regions such as estuaries and bays rely on a certain mixture of freshwater input to the saline environment, which supports different ecosystems such as seagrass beds, which are important to many flora and fauna. So as sea level rises, these areas will be displaced further up into these estuaries and bay environments, and it will limit their ability to be present along Florida's coast. Next slide. And then finally, saltwater intrusion will also affect coastal environments by limiting the Vados water supply that is available. And the Vados water is the water that is above the water or the saturated zone of the water table that terrestrial plants rely on for water.
Okay, 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And this would introduce them to saltwater stress. And it has been said that 21 species are considered threatened.
Okay, so we will briefly run through North Florida and how coastal management is happening there. So some ecosystems that are in North Florida are longleaf pine savannas, estuaries, marshes, beaches, and woodlands. And here is an example of the Choctawhatchee River up in northern Florida near Tallahassee. And here is St. Johns River located in Jacksonville, Florida. Some examples of ecosystems in North Florida. So management methods, and I have a couple of pictures to show. So in the Panhandle, there are mangroves present, and I'll be talking about mangrove protection later in a couple seconds. And we also use beach restoration in both cities. Feeder beaches are in the Panhandle. Beach nourishment happens to Jacksonville, as well as inlet sand bypassing. And sea level rise in northern Florida isn't as big as a prominent issue as it is in southern Florida, as we'll learn about it. So it's just hurricane storms and different natural disasters that causes damage to the coastline. So here's a picture of Florida mangroves. And mainly in southern Florida, there are really big fines for mangrove protection. But as you see in our picture right here, that we have different fines throughout Florida. So they just are protecting mangroves because they are very important for coastline management, as well as coastal management, as well as other things that we've learned from today. In here is an example of beach restoration in St. Johns County Beach. And the costs for these methods, they all are governmentally funded. I could not find an exact number in the FDEP plans that I researched, but in the last 70 years, more than $1.3 billion have been spent for these management methods. And Zane will talk about South Florida.
Okay, very quickly, you only have a minute or so left. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so South Florida, we have a really concentrated coastal population. As we talked about before, a lot of large major cities and a lot of really developed beach habitat and infrastructure to be lost. There's also a lot of coastal forests and Everglades that you're going to see in South Florida and also in the Keys. We've touched a lot on beach restoration and that kind of thing, especially in South Florida. It tends to disrupt a lot of the seagrass beds that we see. We have artificial reefs that are also used in South Florida, created with tire pieces, but they wind up being more disruptive to the ecosystems that they're intended to mimic. And a few images here of how that beach nourishment and restoration would work. And dune nourishment, which is kind of an addition to that. Dunes are helpful with sea level rise because they add a little bit more height to the beaches that we already have and add another layer of protection. They would put native vegetation back into those dunes to help add structure and support and help really remimic that original ecosystem that was there in the first place. The issue with a lot of these methods, as we talked about before, is the cost. It's a temporary process that has to be redone multiple times and constantly upkept. And for one stretch of Miami Beach, it can cost nearly $16 million to have a full restoration effort. There also is a tendency to run out of sand, especially in the Keys, because there's a very specific concentration and mixture of sand that's needed to maintain the ecosystems that are already in place.
Okay, you're going to really need to wrap it up now.
Yeah, so that's just to finish up one of the main costs, or one of the main faults, is that these efforts tend to be human focused. They tend to be needed to repeat a lot, and they tend to be really costly without a ton of thought towards the actual natural ecosystems that they can interrupt. And so then one final slide in conclusion, we like beach restoration. We would rather introduce more mangrove systems and more natural vegetation back into the areas, try to help maintain that. And the most important thing we think to focus on is policy. We believe it's important to elect leaders, and we would be excited to see how, especially this new administration that we are entering, see how they are going to help handle legislation to put into place.
Okay, well, great. And there's the questions. All right, so unfortunately, we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to have to cut you off without questions from the audience, but we'll go on to the next presentation, and thank you very much. Okay, so last up is the Beach Please. So if Beach Please would go ahead and activate their screens and everything, and go ahead and get started. You guys are fine. I'll give you the 15 minutes. We're going to go a little tiny bit over, but go ahead as soon as you're ready.
Cool. All right. Our group investigated the global threat of melting ice caps on coastal ecosystems and the many factors affecting these ecosystems, as well as those changing as a result of these melting ice caps. We're going to elaborate on the local and global impacts of climate change relating to the deterioration of Earth's ice caps and how anthropogenic development has created a positive feedback loop of change to Earth's coastal environments. Next slide, please. There you go.
So since 2004, satellite images have shown that Greenland sheds about 303 gigatons of ice per year, and Antarctica sheds about 118 gigatons of ice per year. And since 2004, the ice melt rate for each of these places has gone up. Greenland has increased by 31 gigatons each year, while Antarctica's ice melt rate has increased by 28 gigatons each year. When this ice melts, it decreases the Earth's albedo. And as you can see from this table shows typical albedo of various surfaces, and fresh snow reflects about 75 to 95% of the sunlight it receives, and ice reflects 30 to 40% of the sunlight it receives. So whenever the ice melts and whenever we don't get as much snow, our albedo decreases, and that sunlight will be absorbed by the Earth and will continue to warm up the Earth, causing a positive feedback loop. Next slide, please. So when the ice sheets melt, they actually alter Earth's gravity field slightly, and it causes the sea level to rise in a way that's not uniform across the planet. On this graph, you can see that when the ice melts, the gravitational pull of the ice sheets decreases, and it causes the sea level to rise further away in the lower latitudes. And this pattern of sea level change is referred to as a sea level fingerprint. And this graph was derived from satellite images, and it was verified by taking the pressure of the ocean bottom in the tropical regions. So I thought this was interesting that the sea level is not uniform across the planet. It rises more in the lower latitudes and actually falls in areas where the ice melts. Next slide.
All right, so the most important part about like understanding like sea level rise and melting ice caps is the cryosphere, which is the frozen water part of the Earth system. It's located on like the top and bottom of our planet in the polar regions, and it's the like thing that controls our planet's temperature and global sea levels. The frozen water needed within the cryosphere is needed to protect the Earth from getting too warm. And so the presence or absence of snow either affects the heating or cooling that is over Earth's surface. And then the photo to the left is basically just showing like the things that affect the changes within the cryosphere, like, and most importantly, like the sea level rise that we're focusing on. You can do the next slide. Within global warming, the increase of Earth's temperatures has ultimately caused glaciers and sea ice to melt. This affects the coastal ecosystems and it makes them become more vulnerable. The rise in sea level affects nutrient cycling, which is present within every ecosystem, and it allows them to be able to like survive. And so without these nutrients, the coastal ecosystems are unable to adapt and recover. And without being able to like adapt, they will eventually have a habitat that they're unable to live in, which is also going to be not suitable for many different species to come and live there as well. Next slide. And then this is just a photo of the coastal ecosystems that are like at most at risk. The ones that are like darker shaded show like a higher percentage of people living in low elevation coastal zones, which are seen like Greenland and like other places like Australia. It's like, I think it's a good photo because it represents how it's impacting our whole globe with the sea level rise, and not just places that do have more like, or like places on the coast. And then, yeah, next slide.
All right. For local impacts, I'm going to be talking a lot about Florida, definitely. But so anyway, so Florida is a really extremely vulnerable state to the impacts of sea level rise specifically, but also as a result of the melting ice and raising global temperatures, ocean temperatures are rising, and that also has impacts. The two biggest contributors to the sea level rise around Florida specifically are the increased volume of water that's coming from the melting ice, and then also the slowing of the Gulf Stream, as mentioned before. The Gulf Stream slows because the influx of fresh water from the ice doesn't sink as quickly coming out of the, or coming south from the north, which generates the energy for the current and just makes the current go slower. But because of that, the water stacks up around the coast and it doesn't leave the coast as quickly. So water will pile up and I guess push on towards the state specifically. Yeah, so some other factors impacting sea level rise, or the sea level specifically, are the land physically sinking as well in Florida, because the limestone base that Florida's on is very porous. And a lot of the land under Florida is full of groundwater aquifers. And we pull from that groundwater, and when you pull the water out, there's a lot of less pressure. So the just environment will physically sink when you take away that pressure. But another one would be just the increasing global temperatures also increase the sea temperatures around Florida, because we're already in a fairly warm climate. And it generates the phenomena of thermal expansion, excuse me, which means the water physically expands by volume and raises the sea level as well. But it's also warmer, which has environmental impacts as well. These factors heavily influence the change of aquatic and terrestrial environments throughout Florida, but also around the world, especially coastal environments. And the most critical impact observed, especially on humans, is the saltwater intrusion that's associated with the sea level rise, pushing into the aquifers around or underneath human populations. And a big problem with this influx of water is, well, one, the ground will physically sink when you draw that water out, but also the saltwater intrusion introduces like pollutants and contaminants to our drinking water, as well as increase the erosion of under the groundwater, but also like our beaches and stuff like that. And the salt water, because it's dense, it'll raise the groundwater, but in doing so, it will flush things out and cause a lot more flooding, especially in like drainage and sewage areas. So like in Miami, they have a big problem with it, and they're renovating their sewage system because with increased flooding, it's really increasing the pollutants that are coming into both groundwater, but also just like the environment on the surface, which would be above all the fresh groundwater. And then with the drainage systems, especially in Florida, a lot of our rainwater flows from the center of the state outwards towards the oceans. But with rising sea levels, it actually puts back pressure and pushes the water back towards the populations, which contaminates fresh water. Like I said, increases erosion, and then it increases flooding, which has urban impacts, but also environmental impacts. Next slide, please. Coastal ecosystems are very vulnerable to sea level rise specifically, but then around Florida, because of both thermal expansion and just warmer waters, coral reefs are a very vulnerable ecosystem. And the warming water greatly increases the balance of ecosystems right off, or the balance of these coral reefs. And I'm from South Florida, and I've actually seen coral reefs degrade over the years from pollution, but also warming seawater. And it's really drastic how shallow ecosystems like that are impacted very, very quickly by even global scale situations like this. And then, so increased sea level and the influx of water into groundwater and drainage systems cause great risks for pollution, contamination, and these pollutants are dangerous both to humans as well as the natural environment around, as like increases of nitrates and other things found in sewage have detriment to plant and animal life all around Florida. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about the melting of the ice caps on a more of a personal level.
Delaney, can you please move a little closer to your microphone? You're hard here. Thank
Sorry.
you.
On the left, we have a chart of the different sea level rise scenarios compared to property value, total population, population over 65, and families below the poverty line. So the people most affected are the elderly and the families below the poverty line. Unfortunately, they are the most vulnerable because they do not have the resources to pick up and move to a safer area, and their houses are unable to sell, and they are stuck with the more severe storm damage due to the melting of the ice. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the most vulnerable areas to sea level rise in the United States. The bar graph in the center shows the population with and without habitats in each state. Florida is the highest. Obviously, it's the largest bar on the graph. But the colors indicate the lowest, intermediate, and highest coastal hazard. They are shown in the different colors. And as you can see, most of the coasts are vulnerable and in the highest portion of the coastal hazard index indicated in red. Without habitats protecting the coast, more homes are vulnerable to sea level rise and the impacts of storm surge. Examples of these habitats are the mangroves, estuaries, wetlands, the coral reefs, like Taylor was talking about. Many times when you add new homes, these habitats are taken away, and they are the biggest protection for the homes, and they need to be preserved. Next slide. A place that is being impacted from the melting of sea ice is the San Francisco airport. This airport lies within 2 feet of high tide, and most of its runways were built on top of coastal wetlands. As you can tell from these photos, it is extremely close to the water, and the high tides and storm surge have threatened this airport, causing delays and cancellations of many flights. And it is only going to get worse with the rise of sea level. And our society is highly dependent on airports, for businesses and for the economy, and for personal reasons as well. Next
2
slide.
minutes, so 2 minutes.
Next slide, please. To keep these airports afloat, they are proposing a 10-mile steel seawall to be constructed in San Francisco. That's what the dotted line is on the graph. The wall is estimated to cost $587 million and to be completed by 2085. So a lot of other airports are doing this as well, like the Oakland International Airport. And it is a very important part for professional and personal travel, and they are a large part of the economy, and a loss of revenue would be very dramatic. Next slide.
Okay, so I'll make this quick since we only have a few minutes left. When the Arctic begins to change through retreating ice and land snow and receding glaciers and thawing permafrost, we're going to see a lot of economic impacts. There are some opportunities that come along with that. That is not to say that they don't have their own downsides to them. Building infrastructure, oil and gas production, and many other revenue streams will become substantial over the coming years and decades. But we also see direct impacts on the ecosystem, such as loss of biodiversity and increases in bacteria. Some indirect economic impacts would include extreme weather patterns, increasing threats to large coastal regions, and repercussions from destabilizing the Arctic climate system. Between all of those impacts, we can expect to see changes in commodity prices, trading patterns, and economic sectors. This is just an overview of like all the changes we're going to see due to sea level rise and what we're already seeing. So increases in pathogens like cholera, decreased tourism, erosion, decrease in food availability, poor water quality, relocation, increased cost of battling sea level rise, and biodiversity loss. Much of the coastal population rely on fish as a source of food. So studies have found that we may see an increase by about 39% in Arctic fisheries, but this would also affect other Arctic fishes because they would be subject to bycatch. And this would lead to unproductive fisheries and collapse of ecosystems. Relocation is also a big thing. And due to increased erosion, that leads to reduction in shoreline, safety of roads and infrastructure,
and loss of biodiversity costs an estimated $500 million in property loss each year in the United States. Relocation increases due to depletion of coastlines, storm surge flooding, tsunamis, hurricanes, infrastructure issues, road degradation, unpreparedness, and contaminated water sources. It has been said that with a 1.5 meter increase in sea level rise, we could expect a 16% reduction of Bangladesh's land area. And then some health issues would be the expansion of cholera epidemics, because coastal communities that experience sea level rise tend to have major epidemics of cholera. And the cholera has been shown to last longer in high salinity areas. Mosquitoes are also a concern as they carry malaria, and they usually breed in freshwater areas but are expected to begin breeding in salt and brackish waters to create a salinity tolerance and therefore a growing population of mosquitoes. And these are our questions.
Okay. So thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? We're a little bit over time, but there's still 40 people or so still online here. So any questions? Well, I was intrigued when you said that the seawall and to protect the San Francisco airport. So I've flown into that airport many times. I have family in that area. And when you fly in, sometimes you look out and it looks like the plane is going to land in the water, and on the last possible second, suddenly the runway appears under the plane. It's kind of a spooky experience. But if they don't finish the seawall before 2085, which I think is what you said, it seems like the whole thing is going to be underwater by then, won't it?
It does. They're starting production, but it is going to take a while.
Yeah, 580 million. That seems like also like a low estimate. Things cost a lot in San Francisco. So yeah, it's a very difficult problem. Is there, I mean, what is your sort of general sense for the team about, and then there was we had other folks who were talking about sea level. I mean, it just seems so grim, like so much habitat is threatened and so much infrastructure and economic investment. It really seems like we're not doing nearly enough. Are there places where countries have done a great deal for sea level rise, more than the United States?
I'm not quite sure, but I know like just generally across the globe, people could probably do better with have better practices for like water management and just the way they build infrastructure moving forward, because it'll be hard you can't really stop the oceans from rising and just building a wall isn't always just gonna fix it. But just finding better practices, like especially in Florida, finding better ways to manage our freshwater resources, as well as our pollution and waste would be a big deal, especially when it comes to health concerns.
It would have been interesting to make a comparison between Florida and the Netherlands, because both of those are very low-lying countries. And the Netherlands, they have a very, very elaborate scheme for sea level rise protection, where they sort of triage and they decide which structures and which places will be defended and which will be abandoned. And they really actually, they're gonna put in Amsterdam, I don't know if anybody's been to Amsterdam, but it's a city that's sort of right on the water and there are canals everywhere. And they're actually putting things on giant floats so that as the sea level rises, the buildings are gonna actually rise up to keep track in some cases. So it's pretty impressive what some countries are doing, but the United States seems to be a little bit disorganized. There isn't sort of a national policy the way maybe there should be.
No.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody for hanging in there. Thanks to all the folks who presented. I guess for the people who still have to present, remember that you just have the 15 minutes. So it's important to practice, how long each section is going to take, and practice the handoffs between the different sections. But you're all doing great, and I've enjoyed these presentations today. And I'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. If you have questions or anything, you can always email Carrie or me. And be safe. Take care.
Professor, I had a question or two.
Sure, Taylor.
So one of our group mates has been having some health issues and he's been in and out of the hospital and whatnot.
Oh, golly. With
Yeah,
COVID?
so you, no, I'm not sure what it is actually.
Okay, well,
But,
doesn't matter, yeah.
but he wasn't able to obviously do his part of the presentation, and I
Right.
don't know how much he's been able to do for our paper either. But I don't know if he's been talking to you much about it or not, or just in
I
general.
don't
But,
think I've heard, well, I've had a couple of students have had actually COVID and, you know, have had to scale back their participation just because they're too sick to work, which can happen.
yeah,
No, I haven't heard. Who is the student?
Brendan, I forgot his last name, Brendan Smith or something, not Smith.
Brendan, okay. Well, I'll check on Brendan. Yeah, and
because he's been in and out of class earlier this semester already. But I
Yeah.
know like just last night or something, he was at urgent care, and I think I ended up going to the hospital too. So
well, okay, well, it's good that your team was able to carry him a little bit. And I mean, is there something that I should do here, or are you
I
concerned?
was just mentioning because I was curious. As for our paper when we finally submit it, I don't know if we'll be able to have his portion. So would it be better to just kind of breeze over his portion, or kind of
Yeah, yeah, depending on what he can submit. Yeah, you probably need, because I'll probably have to ask him to do that later, I guess. Not quite sure how to do that if somebody really is not able to complete. Yeah, so just write a little note. I mean, it doesn't have to be detailed or anything, or disclose any personal details, but just go ahead and let me know, you know, if you really can't submit anything, what we'll do, and I'll have to make a separate arrangement for him. But it won't penalize the grade for the rest of the team, of course. So y'all are doing fine.
Cool. Yeah, I'll pass that on. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, for the folks still online? Let's see, chat. Okay.
Have a good one.
All right. Thanks a lot. Goodbye now, everybody. See you Thursday.